The Brexit referendum ignored the voices of women. We need a final say to rectify the injustice. Well, that seems a bit weird to me, because the only women's voices I heard were on the Remain side, and they lost. Unless you're now telling me, because you of course want to shift the goalposts a little, that because there was no leading party member female, or representation in whichever parliament it is you want to bleat on about, probably European as much as British Parliament, you're going to use that as a stepping stone to claim further sexism in a referendum that is now over 2 years old, ignored by privileged men on both sides of the divide. Right. I don't recall seeing many women's voices even on the Remain side, saying that they were doing anything wrong. Maybe what they should have done, if they really wanted to be heard, they should have been a tad edgy instead of a tad arrogant, and considered what would have happened had we voted leave, because we were overwhelmingly underprepared because of it. In any second referendum, we must be given a chance to shape the terms of the debate. The second referendum, the thing that Theresa May has ruled out, but she's the wrong type of woman, of course, and the thing Jeremy Corbyn refuses to rule out. How very interesting. Decisions about the costs and consequences of the big political decisions should be taken by those who will bear them. That's fundamental to our democracy and at the heart of the problem with Brexit debates to date. What I think is really interesting is that people lost, but they are so desperate to try and prevent what has happened from being completed that they will cling on to any tiny little thing and make it seem like something legitimate. Now, I do understand the concept of giving the British people a final say on the deal. I get it. I disagree with it, because I think the turnout will be absolutely piss poor. I also think we voted leave. If they don't deliver leave, then they have a whole host of problems, most of which will centre around how bad their party is going to get annihilated at the next general election, which, if they don't deliver on leave, will be before 2022 when it should be. And using this, us taking the decision being fundamental to our democracy, we don't live in a democracy. We think we do, but we don't. This has been pointed out to me by a number of people. Thank you, Grim Jim. But I think you're coming at this from a wrong angle. And using gender, it's not really a dick move. It's almost cliché that the Independent would use it. So here we have, women's needs were ignored by privileged white men on both sides of the debate. Two bad things, white and man. Terrible. During the referendum, the boys' club sat and debated itself as a them and us narrative took hold. Well, they wanted to win. Both campaigns were pretty bad, to be honest. Leave centred around the NHS, taking back our control of borders law and all the useful stuff. Even though Nigel Farage was at the front. He's not ideal. But he did get the job done, so congratulations. And then on the Remain side, you had the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who happened to be male and white, with a big shiny forehead. His gender wasn't really relevant. In fact, the majority of the prominent female voices were for Remain, and maybe they weren't debating it. Maybe they weren't, but they were involved. You don't have to lead from the front, and your gender isn't relevant when you are. David Cameron made a big mistake when he called for that referendum. His arrogance was his undoing. He did it because of the rise of UKIP, and when he did, and he lost, he walked away. Theresa May since has taken over, and she's a Remain voter leading the country to leaving. Kind of. If anything, I think most people would agree she is sabotaging the result. Oh, and because I want to point this out now, there are many referendum demographic statistics. For example, this one here, that shows the grouping for age range and gender for who voted Leave and voted Remain. Notice, the greatest ideologues were the young voters, and as you get progressively older, you become more and more nationalist. And to be clear, there is nothing wrong with being a nationalist. If there was, the Scottish Nationalist Party should be abolished. Personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with being proud of your country and wanting to put your country before all other countries. It's when you introduce race I take issue. I just don't care. There were other related demographic statistics that showed how they voted with an ever so slightly more detailed approach. For example, you have the total vote. You have male, female. Females voted 48% to Remain, as opposed to 52% Leave, which isn't too bad. But then you have by which political party. Notice how Conservatives, Labour, and the Liberal Democrats voted differently. In fact, it's quite close. You could maybe blame the Conservatives to an extent, but I wouldn't bother. You also have, by the general election vote, when people decided, which I think is quite interesting because it tells you whether some people came into it already hating the EU, or whether they made the decision nearer the time. As I made my decision very close to the time, I fall very much into in the last week. I think this is all relevant because while you say your voices weren't heard, you were heard. It's just that the majority of your votes were on the losing side, and you may not like that, but that is what it is. Unless we're going to break it down even further and say, of the X amount of people eligible to vote, only Y amount of women actually voted for it, in that Y being the number of people who actually turned out to vote of those eligible, and it was significantly less than men, who clearly made a rather large presence known. But as it is quite a close result, I'd be inclined to believe that that is not the case. Our media reflects and entrenches the same imbalance as our political system. LOL. Analysis by Loughborough University found that men dominated 85% of press coverage and 75% of television time for a significant period of the referendum campaign. Well, tell me now, what were you expecting? For women to be on TV to then say, "Women, we must vote Remain, unite the sisterhood." It's interesting that you do that and want that and beg for that, but if a guy was on TV and he did that, oh my god, sexism. Appealing to gender to unite as a sisterhood, or brotherhood of course, in this context is sexist, and it is also counterproductive to respecting the will of the people. As long as the people are informed, understand the decision they are making, you must respect it. We are 2 years plus removed from the vote, and you, many other media outlets, are still pouting like little children because you are unable to accept we are leaving. This behaviour is petty. It is embarrassing. The demographics showed that women voted yes, the majority of women that voted to remain, but they lost. Maybe instead of alienating the men, why don't you then address the guys that voted leave and say, why did you vote leave? And then instead of calling sexism, which is basically what you do in this article anyway, why don't you respect what they voted for, why they voted for it, and move on? Make the best of your situation instead of looking for something to moan about and act like a precious little victim. On the other side, women make up just a third of the European Parliament, a WAMMINZ representation, and while the EU has been the source of important rights and protections for women, it also needs to be called to task for its poor female representation and its myopic focus on women who work, to the detriment of women who don't. Its focus on trade liberalisation and even deeper economic integration has failed to account for and mitigate gender segregation and discrimination. Do you think this was helped when Germany opened its gates to a culture that does the very thing you are talking about here? You're blaming it on a more progressive set of values that we have, with trade liberalisation and integration of economics. Okay, criticise the very thing that's actually good for us. How about you address the thing that's really bad for women, that's been bleeding into Europe? I think it's over 1 million now have done this. Women's rights will be eroded away the moment you're bred out of existence. I know that sounds sensationalist, but I'm hardly wrong. And I think this concept of representation, because you need to represent the sisterhood and then obviously represent whichever racial group you're from, is ridiculous. Your representative represents you regardless of gender, race, sex, sexuality, faith, although I'd really like faith to just die now. None of it is relevant. None of it truly matters in the grander scheme of things. Politics for the most part is child's play, and I don't mean that in the sense that anyone can do it. I mean in the sense that children just sit there in a room and argue all day while throwing shit at each other. It is quite embarrassing. And looking to criticise our society as you have, you basically are doing that. You crap on what we have that we have built. That yes, men built. And now that women are being introduced to it and getting involved in it, we now need to very quickly have it so it's equal representation. Because while it was built, it now needs to be changed? How about this? How about you spend more time getting more women interested in politics? How about we teach politics at a younger level? Because we don't. In our country especially, we do not teach politics. We should. We should give people a basic understanding of politics. I don't know how they do that, to be honest. It's, beyond me. but I think it would help people to understand what they are voting for if they understand the systems that are in place. And that's why I don't support being in the EU, because the EU systems in place are part deceptive, part clandestine, part, not democratic in the slightest. Hell, our society is more democratic than the EU, and I am a subject, not a citizen. I think I've rambled on long enough. I do apologise. I hope everyone has a lovely Sunday, and thank you all for listening.
Oh, goddowns.
In your arse.
Imagine my shock